Of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills. And yet not so. For what hath we to bequeath but our deposed bodies to the ground? Our lands, our lives, all are Bolingbroke's. And nothing can we call our own but death. And that small model of barren earth, which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghost they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed. All murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state, grinning at the pomp, allowing him a breath, a little seen, to be feared, to kill with looks, infusing him with a self and vain conceit that this flesh which walls about our lives were brass impregnable. And humor thus comes at the last with a little pin, pours through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Cover your heads. Mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, form, tradition, and ceremonious duty. For you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you. No want, feel grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? The scene you just watched was from Shakespeare's Richard II. Now, I'm going to remind you that I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. I'm not a true historian. I appreciate a good story, though. And if you want a great storyteller, Shakespeare is your man. If you want something that's historically accurate, though, forget it. Often the sources he was using to base his plays on weren't accurate to start with. And, of course, he had his own motives for stretching the truth just a little. And it may have been something just as benign as, I have to fill seats. Well, I imagine any historian who goes to see a Shakespeare play or film based on Shakespeare probably spends his entire time going, that's wrong, oh, they should not be using that sword there. Oh. Much the same way I do when I go to see any movie based on a book. Anyway, My goal today is to give you the basics of the real Richard II. Not the version shown in Shakespeare's plays, but the real man. Now, he took the throne in 1377. He was 10 years old, and he inherited the throne from his grandfather, Edward III. His own father, Edward the Black Prince, had died in 1376. Now, no one is going to put a 10-year-old on the throne, not without regents and other advisors to point him in the right direction. And he had some very excellent advisors, his uncle John of Gaunt and his other uncle Thomas of Woodstock, along with others, guided the young king through those early years. In 1381, he had his first real test of kingship at the age of 14. The Peasants' Revolt, led by Wat Tyler, had already marched on London and marched through the Tower of London. Hoping to prevent a second riot, Richard, along with the mayor of London, agreed to meet with Wat Tyler and the other leaders of the rebellion. It didn't end very well for Wat Tyler. Now, accounts vary, but Wat Tyler died at the hands of the mayor of London. In order to prevent his followers from rioting yet again, Richard rode in among them. And if I mangle this quote, I'm sorry. But he announced, "I am your captain. Follow me, and I will see to it you get what you want." Amazingly, they did. And they paid for it a few days later when the leaders of the revolt were all found and executed. And word came down from the throne, "Villains you are, and villains you will remain." He learned quick. By 1387, he's no longer a child, and he's no longer relying on his father's generation to guide him. He is, in fact, being guided by men of his own generation. And didn't that make his old advisors happy? They almost engaged in open revolt with him. In the end, they got what they wanted, and they pledged their undying loyalty to King Richard. 10 years later, and I believe he showed an amazing amount of patience with this, he saw to it that all 5 of those men, the Lord's appellant, they paid. 3 were executed, and 2 were exiled. The exiled, Marlbury and Henry Bolingbroke, who would eventually become Henry IV, were both exiled from England. Now, Henry's father was John of Gaunt, and perhaps as a favor to his uncle, Henry's Bolingbroke was only exiled for 10 years. However, a year later, John of Gaunt died. Richard stepped in and declared all of Gaunt's property his, and Henry Bolingbroke exiled permanently. Sometime later, Richard II went on campaign in Ireland. And as the saying goes, when the cat's away, the mice will play. In this case, Henry Bolingbroke snuck back into the country with the aid of members of the nobility. When Richard came home, much like the scene in Richard II that started this video, he found out that he no longer had any power at all. He was taken, put into confinement in Pontefract Castle. And it's possible he might have remained there to the day he died of old age, had not plots become known that would have freed Richard and saw to Henry Bolingbroke's execution. Whether or not Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, personally ordered Richard II's death, well, the end result was that Richard II, according to most sources, died of starvation. Shakespeare has one of Henry Bolingbroke's men take a more active course. Either event, he died. Now, some historians remember him as a tyrant, while at the same time saying that many of his policies really weren't that much different from other kings. It's very hard to say at this point. He wasn't like his father or grandfather. He wasn't a warrior. He liked art. He encouraged it. Fine dining, fine clothes. The portrait which I use in the beginning of this video was painted of him in his lifetime. Those were the things he valued. He actually wanted to bring an end to the 100 Years' War. And maybe if he had lived, eventually that would have happened. But he didn't. And the after effects of his death would be felt for generations yet to come. In the 1300s, Henry IV, the usurper king, and his grandson would rule over England divided in the Wars of the Roses, where descendants of Richard II's chosen heirs would vie for the crown with Henry VI. So the after effects of Richard II's rule were felt well into 1485, when the third Richard died in battle. Now, this has been just a basic information. And I encourage you to go looking up more about the real Richard II. There are so many books out there. Just don't use Wikipedia. But there's so much information out there that you can use to learn. The members of the Alabama Renaissance Fair have always felt that the fair should be a learning experience as well as an entertaining one. So I end this video the way I've ended several of them. Stay home, stay safe, and keep learning.